Hello, my name is Richard Hale, and a few months ago, I learned the hard way that grief can bring out the best in some people and the worst in others. After my wife's funeral, I made a choice to keep one secret close to my chest, a second house she'd quietly left in my name. At the time, it felt like the only way to protect what little peace I had left, but I had no idea just how much that silence would change everything. The sentence crackled through crystal light like a fuse catching. Phones lifted, tally lamps winked awake at the back of the year-end hall. I was halfway to the lectern slides, waiting when I turned toward the voice that no longer bothered to smile. Ethan Cole, 34, MBA varnish, still shining, stood with a row of younger shareholders' cameras ready. Harrison and Co.'s November ritual had always been hushed and ceremonial. Tonight, New York felt like a televised arena. I kept the clicker in my pocket. Old guard funds leaned in. The growth crowd hummed for theater. Reporters crowded the rear like gulls whispering into mics. Somebody said, "He's hiding something loud enough to be useful." Mr. Chair, Ethan's counsel sang, raising a binder. Point of order. A supplemental proposal, immediate vote to remove the chairman and appoint an independent. Charlotte Reeves, our retired CFO. My truest skeptic sat last row, two fingers brief in the air, don't react here. I met her eyes, nodded once, and let the room listen to its appetite. Let them hear themselves choose spectacle. Ethan stepped to the mic, palms open. He praised the legacy, pitied the present, and promised velocity. Then the threat, 30 days to a confidence vote. The young chorus exhaled on cue. I took the mic without asking, duly noted. Council will vet the motion. If it stands, we convene within 30 days. In the meantime, you came for a plan, you'll see one. I didn't defend a record, I advanced the deck. Debt ladders, supply terms, data stack fixes the boring levers that move a company. The cameras couldn't decide whether to film the plan or the provocation, and in their confusion, film both. Questions came, some sharp, most show. I declined sound bites and offered timestamps. As the applause broke harder in the middle, as applause goes when a room wants a fight, I stepped off the stage. An usher pressed a folded square into my palm. Charlotte's handwriting, cream paper, 2 words inside, dark fund, and a tag item, 8B. Ethan intercepted me at the stairs, cologne impatient. 30 days, he said, lips barely moving for the cameras. Legacy won't save you. Legacy's a story, I said. Paper is power. I passed him without granting the lens our faces. In the corridor, the light went cold. No hallway quotes, I told staff. Rote press to legal, archive everything. Calm as an instrument. You play it by refusing to rush. In my office, I shut the door on the hum and let the city's grid steady my pulse. I set the clicker down, opened Charlotte's note, and pulled a yellow pad close. 30 days, control the agenda. 8B, reconcile disclosures to cash movement. Start with footnotes, then vendors, then shells. Thieves hide where text turns small. I brought up the last 3 10Qs side by side. Same revenue story, same margin arc, yet a footnote had migrated to a different corner. An entity name appeared, then vanished. Line items that should have been neighbors now lived on separate floors. I annotated, printed nothing. My assistant pinged press at the door asking for comment. We respect shareholder rights and bylaws, I dictated. We'll see them in 30 days. I remembered the only lesson a former chairman ever gave me without looking at me. Don't meet a knife with a chest. Meet it with a clock. I sketched a timeline across the margin, audit, interviews, escrow trails, board notice, each box a small hinge I intended to turn one click at a time. I started a new list: who touched the filings, who edited footnotes, which subsidiaries shared directors with thin-shelled vendors, which payments ducked the usual approvals between midnight and 2. The city cooled from silver to black glass. I searched item 8B across minutes, docket logs, procurement notes. There it was, an innocuous header covering a slush of market access retainers. Cross-ref, the counterparty, a shelf entity with a borrowed address and a director who happened to mentor Ethan 5 years ago. I took a breath that reached the bottom and came back with something useful. I didn't call anyone. People who deserve your time knock twice. I let the numbers talk until they stopped lying to each other. At the credenza, an old photo of me with a former chairman watched. The city blinked. Inside office settled into the quiet after decision. I turned off the overheads, left the desk lamp burning, and read the note one more time. Dark fund item 8B like a breadcrumb with an address. 30 days is a long time if you own the minutes. I faced the glass and spoke so only I could hear it. The game begins. Midnight pressed against the glass while a desk lamp carved a tight island of light. The papers Charlotte had steered my way were spread like a crime scene I refused to disturb. On top in her square hand, two words dark fun. My finger halted on a line that lowered its voice 8B acquisition of Nova Tech parties undisclosed. Snow began a slow fall over New York. I worked barefoot on the cold parquet laptop open to a scrubbed ledger, cells grayed out names, mass totals rounded. Outside the city glowed festive. Inside the page stayed clinical. I traced footnotes. Thieves hide where type gets small. Item 8B jumped from an advisory retainer to a vendor I didn't know then to a fund whose charter said nothing while saying everything. Novatech looked clean in public. In private filings, it was a shell with a lease and a logo. I pinged a number I keep for fires, Diana. She appeared in a rectangle of practical light. No filters, hair tied back, the audit chief attention alive in the way her eyes landed. You don't call this late unless something burns. It's a fire in a windowless room. I slid a redacted page under the lens. 8B Nova Tech. Someone hit a pump under a purchase. She didn't speak for 10 seconds. In auditing, silence is a Geiger counter. The masking is amateur, she said, but the plumbing isn't. See the alternating reference codes, hop markers? You're looking at a black bag routing. Ethan's people hard to prove from one sample, she said, though her mouth had decided. The vendor, Graybridge Access Incorporated, last spring. The director on record mentored your nephew. Cayman SPC umbrella behind it. Side pockets named for street trees. Amounts, she breathed out. Enough to move a proxy fight. Enough to buy attention where attention is auction. We worked the ledger like a body. She walked me through hidden columns. I pulled midnight saves and IPs flirting with our systems from hotel networks. Line by line, a picture formed. 8B wasn't an acquisition. It was a spigot. Novatech was a label on a drum. Charlotte left me two words, I said. You just translated them. Charlotte leaves breadcrumbs only if there's bread at the end, Diana said. There's something else. Years ago, legal forced a TT to mirror board packets to an off-site drive compliance theater. Everyone forgot. I didn't. That mirror sits in a storage facility off the parkway. If 8B exhibits were ever prepped, early drafts will be there. Weekend meet, Saturday dawn. Take a car without Bluetooth. Leave your phone in a foil pouch. If Ethan has a friend in security, and he does, he's watching who pulls old boxes. We set the time. Then the screen flashed. A message slid across my notes from an address built from numbers and a season. No greeting. Just a sentence, don't dig. This isn't only about money. Attached a photo of me in the backstage corridor that afternoon, mid-step, shoulders squared, and over my right shoulder, a smear of a face I knew too well. I killed the preview and let the room listen to the air. Somebody had stood close enough to smell the starch in my cuff. Diana saw my eyes change. What is it, noise, I said. Useful noise. I read the line again. This isn't only about money. Of course it wasn't. Money is motive. Power is method. She leaned toward the camera. You still have allies that don't fit neatly on org charts. Use them. Working on it. I ended the call. I stood at the door and watched the snow practice, being new. Far below, the avenue took what fell and kept moving. I returned to the desk and wrote a list with 3 headings. Daylight, Shadow Bridge. Under Daylight moves, we could announce a board-requested review of significant acquisitions, a vendor cleanup, a hotline refresh to outside counsel. Under Shadow, the off-site mirror, the hop markers, the IP scrape, a quiet freeze on Graybridge's cousins. Under Bridge, a reporter who preferred facts to theater. The phone buzzed, press wearing concern like a costume. Any comment on a proposal to remove you? We respect process. I dictated and left it there. I sealed files in an encrypted vault and shut the laptop. The snow fattened. Street lamps made the flakes confetti. The message stayed in my trash, demoted, not erased. I prefer my enemies where I can retrieve them. I called Charlotte. She answered on the first vibration. Well, she said. Your 2 words were a map, I said. 8B is a siphon disguised as an acquisition. Destination trees in the Caymans. What do you need a move everyone can see, I said, in a move no one will admit exists. She exhaled the sound of a plan taking shape. Daylight and dark, then. Daylight and dark, I said. We'll need 1 move in daylight and 1 in the dark. The storage facility crouched at the edge of the industrial park, its low concrete walls holding the night like a secret. Saturday's light was thin, the kind that barely wakes the frost. Richard's sedan, faded paint, no company plates, rolled into a patch of gravel behind the outer fence. He cut the engine and sat still, eyes sweeping the quiet. The absence of motion was louder than traffic. Diana emerged from between two container units, her long coat moving in the wind like a shadow with intention. A keyring swung from her gloved hand, catching the light for half a second before disappearing back into the folds of wool. Inside the air was the dry choke of paper that had been waiting too long. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched into the dim, their steel sides dulled by dust. Cobwebs traced the corners like patient handwriting. By the service door, a man leaned on a mop handle as though it were a cane. Marcus Lane. The years had bent him a little, but not broken the veteran's gaze direct, measuring, already choosing the outcome before you spoke. "You've got 30 minutes before the shift rotation," he said, pulling a ring of old brass keys from his belt. "No log?" Richard asked. Marcus's mouth twitched towards a smile. "We'll pretend you were never here. You'll owe me same as before." Richard nodded. He remembered the favor, different city, same kind of quiet debt. The lock gave up with a tired click. The door swung into a vault-like room lined with climate control units and numbered racks. Diana moved straight to a shelf near the back, her fingers reading the labels faster than her eyes. "Here," she said. She lifted a matte black hard drive, its casing etched with the serial pattern used for the compliance mirror system. Richard slid it into a padded sleeve. "Full mirror every transaction tagged 8B, she said, including the raw email threads. She showed him a snippet on her tablet, Ethan's name, at the top a line below it marked undisclosed benefactor, and language that didn't bother with metaphors, block votes, delivery dates, totals. "They're not just buying influence," Richard said quietly. "They're scheduling it like freight." Marcus reappeared in the doorway, his tone lower now. "You didn't hear it from me, but someone came around last week asking if you'd been here before. Didn't look like company security." Richard glanced at Diana. She was already swiping through security logs. Her expression went flat. External cameras went dark for exactly 1 hour, ending 15 minutes ago. Someone knew we'd be here. The three of them moved fast. Marcus kept watch at the corridor. Diana packed the hard drive cables in a secondary backup. Outside, the winter air felt sharper. Richard's sedan sat exactly as he'd left it, or almost. A door was not quite flush. He popped the trunk. Papers were out of sequence, glove box documents shuffled like a deck. Only one thing stood out, a slip of white torn from a larger sheet left in the center of the empty space. Black ink block letters, 30 days. Goes fast. Diana's breath clouded in the cold. "They're not just watching, they're counting." Richard pocketed the note, locked the trunk, and scanned the lot. "We take my car, they know where to find us. We take yours, they might not." He crossed to her SUV without looking back, the hard drive pressed under his coat like a second heart. Once inside, he let the silence hold for a moment before speaking. "If they want to play fast," he said, fastening the seatbelt, "we'll play faster." Diana pulled out of the lot, headlights slicing through the industrial dark. Behind them, Marcus stood under a security lamp, hands deep in his pockets, watching until the taillights vanished. The city's outline grew in the windshield, and with it, the shape of the next move. In battles where the ground shifts under you, Richard knew one truth remained. You can buy time, you can lose time, but you never get it back. Allies who understand that are worth more than any fund Ethan could conjure. The ballroom of the Manhattan Grand was a cathedral of glass and chrome, polished to a mirror's edge. Screens the size of billboards framed the stage. The air smelled faintly of champagne and the kind of ambition that doesn't leave until dawn. Richard stepped through the revolving doors without hesitation. His black suit was cut sharp, the knot of his tie perfect, his posture clean. In his hand, a silver USB drive caught the light with every swing of his arm, harmless in appearance, lethal in purpose. No one in the swarm of journalists and investors noticed the weight of what he carried. On that drive sat mirrored transaction logs, internal memos, and emails that could turn Ethan's career to ash in under 24 hours. The conference buzzed with the hum of wealth and self-congratulation. Rows of cameras lined the back wall. Every lens tilted toward the stage as Ethan appeared, tailored Navy suit smile, rehearsed the kind of confidence that floats when the tide is high. Flashbulbs fired like distant artillery. Ethan's voice carried through the PA system, rich and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, Nova Tech stands on the edge of the most ambitious expansion in our history." From a seat in the rear section, Richard watched in silence, his face a mask carved from stone. Beside him, Diana's attention flicked between her phone and the stage, the faint glow of her screen reflecting in her eyes. She leaned toward him. One of the board co-chairs just received a massive deposit into his campaign fund, not even laundered through the usual shells. Ethan's tightening his votes. Richard's gaze didn't shift from the stage. How much time, days, maybe less, she murmured. 2 rows ahead, Grace Miller adjusted her press badge. She'd built a reputation at the Financial Herald for dismantling corporate fairy tales with surgical precision. Richard had noted her work years ago, knowing her type was rare fact before friendship, proof before promise. When Ethan paused for effect, Richard's fingers slid the silver USB into an envelope and passed it forward to Grace without a glance. She caught it under the cover of her notepad. Her whisper reached him on the next breath. If I publish now, he'll pivot and bury this before it lands. Then wait, Richard said. But be ready to hit send before he does. On stage, Ethan moved into the second act of his pitch, Novatech's record-breaking funding target. Investors leaned forward, the room tilting toward him. Richard heard the applause building like static. Then the Q&A session began. A microphone moved through the audience. Richard stood when it reached his row. Richard Hale, he said, his voice clear but unhurried. Mr. Cross, can you account for the transactions routed through the Cayman subsidiary last quarter? The shift was immediate. Heads turned. The applause died mid-clap. Ethan's smile faltered only for a second, but enough for the cameras to catch. I'm not sure what you're referring to, he said smoothly. Our operations are fully compliant with because the ledger shows transfers aligning with certain voting blocks. Richard continued, his tone still mild. And that would make your expansion pitch problematic. A murmur rolled through the hall like a low wave hitting a seawall. Investors whispered, journalists scribbled. The moderator cleared his throat, urging the session onward, but the air had shifted. Ethan fielded the next question with the precision of someone whose mind was somewhere else. Richard sat back, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his eyes. When the final applause ended, he slipped into the flow of people heading for the exit. The hallway outside was quieter, but the tension still clung to the air. That was when the man in the gray coat appeared, mid-40s, unremarkable face, the kind you forget until it's too late. He brushed past Richard just long enough to press a sealed envelope into his hand. Richard stopped, thumb sliding under the flap. Inside was a glossy photograph of Charlotte in profile, taken without her knowing. Below it, printed in block capitals, "Keep quiet or she pays." The hallway noise faded into a dull hum. Richard closed the envelope, his fingers tightening just enough to crease the paper. He turned toward the exit, eyes narrowed not in fear, but in calculation. In any campaign, making yourself seen at the right moment can be more dangerous to an enemy than any file. But he knew the other truth: they would always strike where the blood runs deepest. The wind slipped in through the half-open window of Charlotte's apartment, carrying the damp scent of a Brooklyn night. Richard sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the pale light overhead drawing hard lines across his face. Without a word, he slid the envelope toward her. Charlotte's fingers hesitated before touching it, as though the paper itself carried a charge. When she finally opened it, the breath caught in her throat. A photograph of herself taken from a distance without her knowledge stared back at her. "It was on me when I left the conference," Richard said quietly. "Delivered by hand, no name, just this," and a warning. The warmth of the amber-lit apartment did nothing to dissolve the tension that hung between them. Outside, the distant roar of a subway train rumbled through the street like a muted war drum. Tom Vargas arrived 10 minutes later, his heavy boots soft on the worn floorboards. A former unit brother-in-arms to Marcus Lane, he carried the kind of stillness that only came from years in the field. Richard briefed him, with military precision, suspected surveillance on Charlotte, unknown operatives tied to Novatech's internal network. From the hard drive they'd pulled at the storage facility, a pattern had emerged. Ethan wasn't just stealing votes. He was curating an inner circle shadow enforcers who existed to intimidate, to silence, and to make problems vanish. One profile in particular made Richard pause. A man with a scandal buried 15 years ago, someone Richard had crossed paths with back when both their names still carried weight in the same industry. Tom laid a folder on the table. "Street cam 2 blocks east. SUV black parked for 3 hours the night before you got that envelope. Registered to a shell company. Guess who it ties back to Novatech?" Richard said flatly. "Bingo." Meanwhile, Diana had pushed through her own channels, sending Richard a secure brief. Ethan was prepping a press release that painted Richard as a bitter ex-executive, sabotaging progress. The timing was surgical. It would hit the news cycle the morning after Ethan locked down the board's final votes. Richard leaned back thinking, this wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about shifting the fight onto terrain Ethan couldn't control. We won't attack head-on, Richard decided. We'll give them a shadow to fear. He encrypted the entire 8B dataset financial logs vote purchase trails, encrypted internal memos, and sent it to Grace Miller. His instructions were precise, no immediate publication. Instead, the packet would be delivered to a group of key investors hours before the board meeting, giving them just enough time to digest it in panic. If Ethan's scheme was built on their confidence, the sudden fracture in that trust would hit harder than any headline. Tom, meanwhile, vanished into the night with the quiet confidence of a man who knew how to follow ghosts. His target, the SUV's driver, the one thread they could pull that might unravel the rest of Ethan's intimidation network. By midnight, Richard had drawn up his counterattack in meticulous detail. Every move accounted for every risk weighed. He was ready to flip the board until his phone vibrated on the table. The message was short, no signature, meeting date changed. Tomorrow 10 a.m. Richard stared at it, his mind running the clock. Ethan had moved up the timeline. The careful build-up, the investor dropped the psychological squeeze it had just been forced into. Fast forward. He placed the phone face down, exhaled through his nose, and looked at Charlotte. They think speed is on their side, he said. His tone was calm, but in his eyes there was steel. They've just given me permission to hit first. The truth sat between them like a loaded weapon. In this game, fear wasn't a side effect. It was the currency, and Richard had just decided who was going to spend it. The boardroom on Novatech's 40th floor was an icebox of glass and steel, the morning sun cutting hard angles across the polished table. Outside, the city sprawled in winter haze. Inside, the air was tighter, colder than the weather. Ethan sat at the head of the table, every inch the confident executive. The faint curl of his smile betrayed nothing but certainty. To his left and right were the directors whose loyalty had been bought and paid for, each one with a contract in front of them, ready to sign. The double doors swung open. Richard stepped in, flanked by Diana, Charlotte, and Grace. Each carried a slim black folder, their expressions stripped of anything Ethan could read. "Mr. Hale," Ethan said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "We didn't expect you to join us this morning. Tight schedule, you know." Richard took his seat without asking permission. "I'll be brief." The room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a harsh white glare bouncing off the documents laid out across the table. Voting tallies, revised investment contracts, the facade of corporate order. At the far end, two key investors, Kellen, broad-shouldered and silent, and Rosita, sharp-eyed beneath a dark bob, watched the exchange without betraying where they stood. Their presence was the pivot on which the entire meeting would turn. Ethan began with his performance. "Our latest quarter exceeds projections. As you can see," he tapped the pristine graphs projected on the screen. "We're entering the final stretch with a clean balance sheet, strong investor confidence, and a secured product launch. There's nothing to worry about." Richard leaned forward, fingers tapping once against his folder. "Unless, of course, the numbers have been curated." He flipped the folder open and slid a series of printouts toward the nearest director. On the screen behind Ethan, Diana queued up an email chain, timestamped, traced, and cross-referenced, detailing wire transfers from Novatech's accounts into a Cayman shell company. At the bottom of each record, Ethan's approval stamp. Grace's voice cut through the sudden silence. "Under securities law, these transactions carry not only financial penalties, but criminal exposure. This packet is already prepared for shareholder action and, if necessary, federal review." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could counter, Richard's phone buzzed on the table. A single glance at the message and he looked up. "Tom's update," Richard said evenly. "The black SUV outside Charlotte's apartment. It's in impound. Inside, joint account details tied directly to your Cayman structure." Murmurs broke out along the table. Diana stepped in, dropping another page onto the stack in front of Kellen and Rosita, expense reports showing company funds funneled to consulting services that were nothing more than Ethan's personal payouts. The hit came fast. One of Ethan's strongest allies, a trustee who had campaigned on his behalf for months, leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "I'm withdrawing my support." Kellen and Rosita exchanged a glance. Rosita closed her folder with a decisive snap. "I move for an immediate vote," she said. The count was swift, clinical. Ethan's majority crumbled in seconds. By the end, the board secretary's voice was steady motion carried. Mr. Ethan Cole is hereby suspended from his role pending internal investigation. The room shifted just enough for Richard to feel the axis change. Control was no longer in Ethan's hands. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan brushed past Richard at the doorway. His voice was low venom, threaded through every word. "You won this round, but the game isn't over." Richard's reply was calm, almost conversational. "I'm not playing your game, Ethan. I'm clearing the board." He stepped into the corridor, the city spread out below like a living chessboard. For all the months of maneuvering the emails, the data hunts, the quiet nights of planning. It wasn't luck that had brought justice. It was preparation, timing, and the choice to fight for his own terms, not just to bring an opponent down. In the world Ethan had tried to rule, victory was often measured in trophies or titles. Richard knew better. The real win was walking away with his autonomy intact, and the board reset for a future Ethan would no longer control. In the end, Richard walked out of that boardroom, not just with his position restored, but with his integrity intact. Ethan's schemes had crumbled under the weight of hard evidence and precise timing. It was proof that justice isn't about striking first, but about striking right when the truth is ready to land its blow. And in that quiet victory, Richard knew he hadn't just won a fight. He'd reclaimed the right to decide his own future.